Welcome to the Business and Society podcast. I'm your host, Senthil. The New York Times recently reported that many businesses are quietly ditching their climate goals and net zero targets. But the real question isn't why companies are backing down. It's what happens to all of us when they do. In this episode, I sit down with Rebecca Henderson to explore the constraints facing businesses and what it will take for the private sector to step up as a steward of democracy and our climate. Rebecca is one of 25 university professors at Harvard, a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a fellow of both the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her latest book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, was shortlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey 2020 Business Book of the Year Award. Rebecca, welcome again. Great to have you on the show.
Senthil, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
I think this conversation is very timely. Did you see the Economist cover this week?
Tell me what's on the cover.
Yeah, a person is sitting by the beach under an umbrella, and the title says, "It's too darn hot, and the umbrella's on fire."
I have not seen that issue yet. Okay, I bet it's in the mailbox. Wow.
That said, I think the conversation societies are having today is more about climate change, a fact or fiction. Where do you see this heading, the entire discussion about climate change and businesses' commitments about it?
In the businesses I work with, there's no debate about whether climate change is real. I think the science is really quite strong. And more than that, people are experiencing really significant changes in our climate and seeing the consequences. And business leaders often are better informed and have longer time horizons. So while I've met many business leaders who question whether they should take action personally against climate change, I don't think I've met any that say, look, it's really not happening. But that may be, Senthil, because, I wrote a book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. So the business people who come to talk to me or come to my talks are not likely to be those who doubt the underlying reality of the science.
The New York Times recently wrote a column about this trend that many businesses are silently ditching their climate goals or net zero targets. You're also a scholar who worked on democracy, so you see how business and democracy intersects. I'm keen to hear your thoughts. Are businesses simply following the larger political trends?
I think so. Like you, I've seen many businesses back down, and I read that piece in the New York Times. It certainly jives with my own experience. I think the thing is this, to some degree, acting on climate is NPV positive. That is, you can act on climate and make money as you do so. And in my book, I talk about firms like Walmart and others who show that by going after energy costs and insulating buildings and getting more efficient, you can really save a lot of money. And there's the example of a firm like the private equity firm KKR, which every time it buys a new firm puts in an energy and water team because reducing energy and water use is so profitable. But the issue is this, you can only get so far. At Harvard, for example, we took down our greenhouse gas emissions by about 40%. And we thought we were making money the whole way. Every investment we made paid for itself. But beyond 40%, it gets much harder and much more expensive. It depends on the business, of course, and on the organization. But in general, you can get about halfway there, which is a very long way. But you can't get 100%. Getting to zero is actually at some stage going to be expensive. And these companies who signed up for things like net zero commitments, they were responding to the political climate. To a large extent, they were responding to employees who wanted to know that the companies they were working with were doing the right thing. Sometimes they were responding to customers. Sometimes they were responding to investors. There were large investor coalitions saying, oh my goodness, if we destabilize the climate, that's going to lead to significant long-term problems for our entire portfolio. So we're going to insist that every firm in our portfolio takes action against climate. Alas, and the last lever was, and by the way, regulation is coming. It really looked as though the governments of the world were going to push hard against greenhouse gas emissions and really try to make progress on climate. So it was rational for a company to say, okay, we can get like a third, half the way there, making money all the way. And for the rest, well, there are these other factors that make it worth doing. Not that expensive, we can do it. The trouble is those other factors have sort of gone away. And if you're competing with firms that are reneging on their climate commitments, they're saying, well, fossil fuels are still cheap, they're still available, I don't need to change out my energy systems, why should I? Then it's hard sometimes to resist the pressure to go long and to also cut back your own climate commitments. And I think that's what's happening.
Mm. Do we have a percentage of business that falls into this category, the category that's serious about tackling climate change and net zero versus businesses that don't care? Do we have any data?
I know of no good, solid data. There are firms who have kept their commitments. Certainly there are firms I work with that are still very much committed to reducing their emissions and to making a difference against climate. Often because they see it as absolutely integral to their business model. So a lot of the firms in the food sector, for example, can see that climate is really shifting the way we grow food and the nature of the food system. So they're still very much focused on climate commitments. But my guess is it might have gone from half being really serious to maybe 25%, but I am guessing. I really do not know.
Mm. Assuming that it's 50 to 25, that's a big drop, particularly in the context of reading a chapter on your book, Rethinking Capitalism, amazing book. You wrote about free riding, right? I mean, if you want to make such systemic change, I think most of the players should jump in and embrace the work to address global warming. But what we are seeing seems to be a big reversal. What would be the implications of this for businesses as a sector or a industry?
I think it varies sector by sector. And it depends what you think is going to happen. So let me talk about what I think is going to happen. And of course, I have no monopoly on truth and we have no idea. But I think it quite likely that now action on climate change has slowed so dramatically and the world is warming so much more quickly than it has been historically, that we will increasingly start to see large-scale physical effects from climate change. So here in New England, for example, we've had several days of smoke so bad that you really couldn't go outside without damages to your health. So that slowed down economic activity, that has a real effect on the whole economy. I think we're going to start seeing rolling partial systemic breakdowns in energy, transportation, water, and food. The thing about climate change is as it starts to hit, as we get massive wildfires, as crops start to fail, as water becomes scarcer, as we're trying to clean up after climate disasters, the state has to spend more and more resources just playing catch up. And so there are fewer and fewer resources to either reduce the rate at which climate change is happening by switching fuels, or to harden infrastructure and prepare for change. So it's as if, well, we know that we have to, say, move all our air conditioning units up to the roof of the building because we can see we're going to get increasing floods. And so if we don't do that, then it'll be a disaster. But we don't do it. We don't have the money. Why don't we have the money? Because we're fixing what went wrong 6 months ago. We know that we need to do something about increasing the size of the storm drains, but we don't have any time to do it. We don't have any resources. The next big flood causes enormous damage. Now we really don't have time to fix the storm drains. So you can imagine a world in which these kinds of failures start to cascade one on the other. So the effect for business is that things are going to become increasingly volatile. It's going to be harder to rely on the stability of the supply chain, whether that's because you're not sure you can get critical components from China or the Far East or wherever you're trying to get them, or because flooding is taking out ports, or because you're seeing fire, which is making distribution difficult. So the whole volatility of the world is going to shift. Sometimes people say, well, climate change. So climate's going to go up by 3 degrees. Well, that's not that much to worry about. Although when you look at the climate maps, that means hundreds of millions of people starting to live in locations where they can't work outside for 2 or 3 months of the year. We're going to see mass migration, I fear, from the equatorial regions to the more temperate regions. And that will have all kinds of effects on politics and social stability. But for business, 3 degrees, well, how much does that really matter? What it means is when things happen, they happen much harder and faster than you planned for. So if you have facilities on the coast, for example, it's not that sea level rise is going to go up by 6 inches on average. Who worries about 6 inches on average? It's that what climate change is supercharged the entire climate system. So there's much more energy in the system. So a 6 inch on average sea level rise means high tide, unusually high tides of 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 feet. So if you have facilities on the coastline, they become increasingly vulnerable. In Texas, for example, at Corpus Christi, I don't know if you saw that. Corpus Christi as a city is running out of water. And that's important because, well, people need it to drink, but also because they built a large industrial infrastructure, mostly around chemical processing, that's totally reliant on the supply of clean water. And Texas will not allow climate change projections into its projection of water availability. So the state models are consistently giving local municipalities far too generous a sense of how much water there's going to be. And the city is now on the edge, literally, of running out of water because they didn't plan for climate change. If the city has no water, you can maybe build desalination plants, but the cost of water obtained through desalination is, of course, much, much higher than that obtained from rainfall. So as a business person, I think what's going to happen to many firms is it's going to look like the costs of your input and their availability and your ability to distribute things is going to oscillate in unpredictable ways. Sheer physical risk as the world starts changing.
Scary. How much some of the key stakeholders, say consumers or investors, care about climate change? Of course, people who work in our space have this echo chambers that, like consumers demand sustainable products, investors want sustainable investments. But we don't see that happening in a massive scale. It's not a majority. It's still on the fringes. Is that a fair observation or your research shows some interesting findings?
I think you're exactly right. When I first started working in this field about 20 years ago, many people hoped that consumers would be a real lever for change, that consumers would insist that the products they bought came from climate-friendly companies, except in a very few categories, and they tend to be categories where you're selling to higher income, often female consumers who do tend to care and will pay a bit more. Most people will not pay more for sustainable products in general. They will switch. If you can provide a product that is as good as everything else on the market, and yet is also more sustainable, plays its role in climate change, doesn't employ children in the supply chain, consumers will shift. That result is quite robust. But of course, sometimes that's hard. So you might think, well, does that mean consumers are not going to be a real lever for change? And here I think there's something deeply uncertain. It is possible that as climate change gets worse and as more and more people experience its physical effects directly and immediately, if their house burns down, if their children develop asthma, if there's no more water coming out of the taps, if the availability of certain kinds of foods really, really falls dramatically, that consumers may start to take climate change more seriously. And indeed, that consumer sentiment might tip. And so you can imagine a world in which people turn on companies and say, you made money by throwing essentially all your waste into the atmosphere, and we are now choking on it, and our world is dying. And a real political backlash against the firms that haven't played a significant role. That might happen. Who knows? Our best historical examples are around slavery and child labor, where for a long time, I'll talk about child labor because it's much closer in time. For a long time, firms were using child labor. No one was really paying much attention. And then journalists went and started visiting the factories, seeing what was happening, taking photographs of the children, actually documenting the immediate effects. And now, although child labor does still exist in supply chains, no major American or European or Australian company would say to their shareholders, well, yeah, of course we have children in our supply chain. They're really cheap and they don't form unions, and so why not? So there was a huge normative shift in what was considered appropriate in how you run a firm. And you could imagine that might happen in the case of consumers and climate change. But if that doesn't sound that convincing, let's try investors. As you know, since you were kind enough to read my book for a long time, and in fact, I think still now, I continue to hope that investors may, in fact, play a really important role in shifting how firms behave. Well, why might that happen? Well, firstly, they have much more concentrated power than consumers. Most of the world's wealth is concentrated in relatively few hands and is concentrated in the hands of relatively few fund managers. So that's not that many people that you have to persuade to move. That's good because it means less persuasion, but it's also good because it really helps with cooperation. If the secret to getting investors to really insist that firms really have to take climate change seriously, they have to believe every other investor is going to do the same thing. Because this is only going to work if everybody moves, right? If I take climate change seriously and start spending and you don't, then I'm at a competitive disadvantage. If as an investing firm, I'm investing in climate change friendly firms and no one else is pushing all the firms in their portfolio to invest, then I'm going to be at a disadvantage. So you need people to really act in concert. And the great thing about investors is, as I said, there's not too many of them. Depends how you count. Some people say there is a room in which 15 people who control 60% of the world's financially traded assets get together. One of my colleagues wrote a book about this. He called it The Problem of the 12, that kind of concentration of power is dangerous for other reasons. But for this reason, it might be good. So why might investors start to insist that the firms in their portfolio take climate change seriously and start to work against it? Well, they might do that. Let's think about two reasons. The first might be because they genuinely care about the long-term well-being of the people who've given them money. So in the case of the large pension funds, for example, which are a huge fraction of investment funds across the world, in principle, those funds are held in trust to benefit people who are going to need pensions in 10, 20, 30 years from now. And so if you're an investor on behalf of those pensioners, if you're fiduciary to those pensioners, yes, you want to get good, decent returns on your investment, so there'll be money to pay pensions. But you might also think it's important that you have a relatively stable economy and a relatively stable climate that can sustain that economy to their future well-being. And the example I know best in this area is that of the leader of the Japanese government pension fund, one of the largest accumulations of capital in the world, who came to the conclusion that his fiduciary duty absolutely required him to push the firms in his portfolio to take account of climate change. Japan is particularly vulnerable to climate change for all kinds of reasons. And he could see that, I might have lots of money, but if Japan becomes unlivable or just much hotter and drier and then colder and wetter and it's harder to grow food and all kinds of problems, I won't have done my real duty. And he started pushing the fund managers who were managing the Japanese pension fund money to move in this direction. Another way, so that would be sort of mechanism number one, is I really take seriously that I'm fiduciary for other people whose money I'm managing. The second mechanism is to say, wait, there's an undiversifiable risk here. So if there is a risk that threatens the entire portfolio that I can't get around by investing, say, okay, I won't invest in food companies, or I won't invest in energy companies, or I won't invest in construction companies, because all of those are going to have, troubles as climate change gets worse, or insurance companies. You might think investors would go, I'll just avoid the problem of climate change. But the problem with climate change is it's going to hit everything. It's going to reduce valuations, our expectations of economic growth enormously across the board. So if what you're trying to do is make money, you should really care about that. So in principle, you should get together with other investors and say, look, this risk is coming at all of us. Let's all invest together to head it off. And for a long time, I hoped that mechanism would kick in. I still hope that, because it's true. We are looking at a massive undiversifiable risk that will make, significant areas of the world uninhabitable at certain times of year, that will trigger mass migration, that will affect human health across the entire planet. I mean, it's worth dealing with. But as you suggest, at the moment, most investors have pulled back. I must add to this, so far as I know, many of the big family-owned firms, the long-term accumulation of generational capital, they're still all over sustainability. And I think that's because they have this kind of long-term perspective really baked into how they think about managing money.
That's amazing. I was speaking to another case who said, whenever a company goes public or they list in the market, they lose their purpose. That was his findings from a research. That's it. Talking of investors, one of the ideas you proposed in your book is investors have too much power. Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Now, I wanted to ask, yeah.
Yes. I do. I think investors have too much power in general.
In general, right? Now, the book you wrote, it was 4 or 5 years back. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, we definitely see a trend where shareholders themselves are getting weakened because of the classes of share and the massive companies which history have never seen. In fact, I was reading a column in a magazine says that firms are too powerful that neither capital nor governments can enforce ordinary rules on them, which we see. There are big bankers who threaten government saying that, hey, if you levy tax on us, we'll move out of country, right? These are news that's happening as we speak. Do you see that this is a big shift from the time you wrote about this idea, or this is something you expected, that shareholders losing their power and few big guys taking control?
So I think you're pointing to two questions. One is the immense political and economic power possessed by very large organizations, like the big bank you mentioned. Mm-hmm. My guess is that big bank thought it was operating in the interests of its shareholders. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is these very large firms where often the founders control a supermajority of the voting rights. Or, for example, as in the case of Anthropic, when the firm is owned by a trust. So investors have very limited power.
Beautiful,
so
yes,
is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes.
So the answer is always going to be it depends. But in general, I think many investors have too much power. That pushing firms to make short-term decisions to kick up the revenues or to simply satisfy the stock market is for many firms a mistake. And I would really recommend you look at a new book by Eric Ries. I don't know if you come across it, called Incorruptible.
Yes, I'm reading it now. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm really with Eric on this. I think that if you are beholden to a group of people who at any moment can force you to do something merely to jack up short-term returns, your ability to make long-term commitments to your customers, to your employees, to your suppliers goes way down. So Eric, as you know, quotes all kinds of statistics suggesting that mission-driven firms, mission lock-in firms outperform the rest of the market. I find that research highly variable. So I myself am very reluctant to say that having a mission-driven firm will automatically give you higher profitability. I'm not sure. It might. I'm sure it will give you more agility, more innovation, much more positive impact on the workforce and community where you work, better quality products. I mean, I think it will give you all kinds of good stuff. But will it give you, better shareholder returns for sure? I don't know. But when we're talking about issues like really investing in the community or addressing problems like climate change, I think we want firms with that kind of long-term commitment who don't think they're going to be forced out because they invest in, say, renewable energy and it lowers returns for the next year and boom, they're out on the street. I was talking to a very senior business person from Taiwan who has invested heavily in renewables. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because we're an insurance company. And so we really care about the long term and we really want to build trust with our customers. And that's central to the business. And so he spent the money to start to begin to move in the renewable direction. Would he have been able to do that in the US capital market with classic investors? I don't know. So in general, I think investors have too much power. Is there a danger when you give all the power to a founder? Which, notice, there are other ways to make sure that investors don't have too much power, right? And Eric's wonderful book gives you some other mechanisms. He talks about being committed to the mission rather than the individual. And that, I think, is a better way to go because, of course, if you give too much power to any one individual, it corrupts. We just know it does something funky to the human brain. And so you have these very large organizations run by people who are no longer really thinking straight. Is that a good idea? Absolutely not. So I think investors have in general too much power, but the mechanisms I would use to reduce that power focus much more on long-term commitment to the mission than they do on giving all the power to one single individual, which I think is highly risky.
Rebecca, our conversation so far taken the assumption that businesses have role to make society better, but there are scholars starting from Friedman until today who argue that the business of business is business. They shouldn't get into the business of society and sustainability. What is your take on this, given it's your life's work?
In 3 minutes.
Yeah. If you can.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so here goes. In a perfect world, the business of business would be to do business. There are all kinds of reasons you don't want business meddling in politics or making policy decisions. You want them, turning out widgets really efficiently, great quality, treating the workforce well. But we do not live in that perfect world. And it's imperfect in several different ways. The most obvious is that in many parts of the world, the state is not very strong. So the reason that Milton Friedman could say the business of business is business, don't get involved elsewhere, is because he was assuming the existence of a strong state that could, for example, put in place workforce regulation so that it was illegal to put workers in really dangerous or difficult situations, or it was illegal to dump toxic chemicals into the local river. And if you assume that you have a strong state that's making sure that business cannot actively create harm to the community or the environment, well, then yes, business's role is just to make profits. But when the state is weak, and we can think of many countries in the world where the state is weak or corrupt, then, the fastest way to make money may be to corrupt the local political system, to bribe the labor inspectors, to bribe the environmental inspectors. And now I can do anything I want, throw the toxic chemicals into the water, deplete the aquifer. Who cares about the long-term health of this community? So under those kinds of situations, when you have a weak state, I think it's very dangerous to assume that if I'm a business person, just putting my head down and just making money is going to lead to a good outcome. It might, but it might not. And as part of that, and we're seeing this even in quite strong democracies like America and other places, that if there are no controls on political activity, business has a strong incentive to spend a lot of money to subvert the political process. So, famously, the current president of the United States said to the fossil fuel industry, I can give you what you want. All I need is $1 billion. It's like, okay. Might have got the exact wording wrong, but essentially that was the deal on the table, or to the crypto guys. I'll give you what you want. You want less regulation, but, I'll take a piece. Nod, nod, wink, wink. When firms can actively shape the political system, then what happens to what Friedman said? Friedman said maximize profits. Okay. Well, that means corrupting the political system. Not good. So I think in situations where there's a weak state or an apparently corrupt state, business has a very significant role to play in what I call now, I don't think I use this term in my book, I call it stewardship of the system. So just as we all have an interest in addressing a problem like climate change because it's going to hurt all of us, I think as business people, we all have an interest in a stable, high-functioning democracy, in the rule of law, in a media environment where it's clear what truth is. We have mechanisms to decide what's true and how we're going to adjudicate truth. Business has a very strong interest in those kinds of institutions. Now, of course, again, there's a collective action problem. So firms may say, well, yeah, I care about democracy, but I have 18 other things to worry about. And, why should I put democracy at the top of the list? I was once on a Zoom call with a whole bunch of senior CEOs trying to persuade them that they had a shared interest in the maintenance of democracy. And they just, we have so many things to worry about. Oh my God, democracy on top of everything else. And I'm deeply sympathetic. But there was one of the CEOs in the room who'd grown up in a weak state regime. And these were mostly American CEOs. She looked at them and she said, you know what it's like to operate in a weak state. You know what happens when democracy goes. You know the costs of letting this happen here. And really trying to mobilize the group around this collective problem. What my historical research suggests is that, yes, business does sometimes cooperate around these kind of massive social problems. But usually, alas, only when things are on the edge of collapse or have collapsed. So you see it, for example, in Chile under Allende or under Pinochet, when the political regime gets so bad that it's really, really hard to make money. We saw it in Brazil during the restoration of democracy in the 80s and 90s. When the situation gets so bad that it's affecting really how well the economy works, then business wakes up and finds that it has this collective action capability. Because here's the thing, business is so much more powerful than it thinks. Where is most of the power on the planet? A lot of it's in the large corporations. They have the assets, they have the access to capital. We're not going to solve most of the problems we face without their help. So I really, really hope we can persuade more businesses to become aware of this larger system stewardship capacity and more willing to work with other firms in its support.
Mm. Because you argued democracy in the success of business, like today we live in a world where nobody denies that many of the business from China is very successful and are growing fast. In fact, most of the world is scared by the speed businesses are catching upon innovation. Given that you are one of the very few scholars who just combine these diverse disciplines of democracy, business, I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on this? Is it like a short-term phenomenon, or like the world has moved that democracy no longer have that competitive advantage?
It's such a great question. And I am not a China scholar, right? So everything I'm going to say comes from reading secondary accounts. But here's my interpretation of what has happened and is happening in China. Firstly, for many years, although China didn't appear to be democratic, it was, in the sense that those in power had to get support for their policies from local regions, from community, from governors and mayors of cities. So that while the group at the very top of the Chinese system was powerful, it opened a pretty wide space for discussion and debate. So, if you're trying to do something through, can you get it through Shanghai? Well, how does that, work in Western China? And there was, in fact, and I'm getting this just from friends who've worked and studied in China, that there was, in fact, quite a lot of conversation and openness, which I think as they were moving to catch up was particularly helpful. Of course, what we're seeing now is a much tighter control of power in China, as far as those of us on the outside can tell. And now, as you say, they're not catching up. They are moving right ahead. I hear from friends in science and engineering that in many fields, it looks as though the Chinese are making discoveries that are significantly beyond those in the US and Europe, which is amazing for the Chinese. I mean, all power to them. So why and how is that happening? I really do not know. One possibility, and I'm sure you read the wonderful book about the Chinese are engineers and the Americans are lawyers, but one possibility is a cultural bias towards getting things done and building things. Another is a deeply rooted cultural assumption that the rulers, even though they have a great deal of power, and yes, they may help themselves to a bit of the money that's flowing by, but fundamentally their role is to take care of the nation, to build a strong nation, to build community coherence, to build the power and might of the nation, so that the ruling elite, even though it's got a lock on power, does in fact at some level have the good of the whole population at heart. So that may be part of what's happening. It may be also the case that the democracies, this is not news, the democracies in many other parts of the world are faltering. And we are seeing a real slowdown in the ability of the large democracies to get things done, to build community cohesion. In the United States, we have a president who appears to be actively hostile to the scientific enterprise, which a bunch of my early work was in the effect of university spending on research and development on economic growth. It's hard to estimate, but there's no question, but it's enormous. If you have a regime that's actively hostile to science, that is, taking moves that many economists think will really harm the economy, that's pulling down the workforce, well then maybe it's not surprising that China's getting ahead. So that may be what's going on too. And it may also be, and I think this is a deep conversation, that it's hard to operate democracy under modern conditions in the very large state with a contaminated media environment and strong polarization and people pushing that strong polarization using fear and hatred and othering to kind of drive the society apart. Most major democracies appear to have always needed what's sometimes called civic love. That is, at some deep level, to make a democracy work, you have to think that the community is the thing we all care about. And you have to invest in what's sometimes called civic infrastructure. That is, helping people understand the issues, know what's going on, get involved in local politics. And many democracies, both that sense of civic love, it's the whole nation. Even though I don't like you and I disagree with your policies, you're still one of us and I'm happy to work with you. That's essential for a well-functioning democracy. And then the other is people feeling they have agency and can get involved and can make a difference and that's worth doing. And alas, in many of the major democracies, both those things seem to be eroding. If that's an important factor, it's not so much, West democratic, China not. It's more like democracy in West, like really not working very well. And maybe autocracy is a better way to run things. An efficient autocracy with the good of the people at heart is more efficient than a badly functioning democracy. But, these are huge questions that people have debated for centuries. That's just my take as to what might be happening.
That's very interesting. I tend to agree on the piece about Chinese governments, the interest in listening to their people. From my own personal example. So one of fellows in my cohort at Harvard, he's a professor at Tsinghua. And I was having a quick coffee chat with him. And of course, we know all about China by reading things on Western newspapers, right? The control and stuff. So he said, yes, the government, the Communist Party have some red lines. But here is what actually happens. The government calls us and asks us, what can we do better? Is there something you find we are doing could be improved? So they welcome criticism. So I could clearly relate.
I have the same sense from people who work a lot in China that, they won't tolerate large-scale public dissension, but in private from the right people, they do ask and listen.
Impressive. So the risk and interesting thing about talking to people like you is we can completely hijack the topic from climate change to democracy. But tell me, what's the future of democracy? If you say that democracy is not functioning, how it's going to unfold, and what are the impact of that to the business sector?
Sentinel, as if I knew. Okay, so here's my guess. This tension between autocracy and the concentration of power and wealth and real democracy and everybody's included is going to be the defining tension of the next 50 to 100 years. And it's going to be complicated in a couple of ways. One is if I'm right about things are going to get worse, economic growth will falter, the lights will flicker on and off, sometime the food won't come, the water supplies will be unreliable. You can imagine two responses to that. One is a desperate doubling down on more autocracy. We really need help. We need someone to fix these problems. Let's just get the strong person, give them all the power, let them take it away. Or a turning towards, whoa, we better make this community, this city, this region more resilient, better functioning, tighter coherence, local democracy, because we have to fix our own problems. The people in the center, they're not coming. We have real trouble. And of course, the problem with the autocratic solution is, and we know this historically, it doesn't work. An autocracy tries to center all the information in the center. If it stops listening to what's really happening on the ground, then its ability to deliver what people need is really compromised because everyone needs something different in every different region or every different industry. So in the long run, the kinds of disruptions and increasingly kind of chaotic economic and physical environments we're going to be in will, in the long run, foster the distribution of power and the rediscovery of democracy. But how long that long run is, I don't think we know. I think it's really important to support and call out and showcase those places where this kind of local civic cohesion and economic cohesion is working really well now, to help other people begin to do that at the local level. Because I think that's going to be really important as things go forward. But yeah, I think the question you asked is going to be the question.
Coming back to the climate change, Before we got into the democracy discussion, you talked about weak states and strong states. So even in strong states, there are businesses with really good intent, right? They want to do good to the world. But the market in which they operate now, for the reasons, the energy crisis, war, it's even harder for them to survive, right? Because consumers are not footing the extra cost, like they are facing their own cost of living pressures. The input costs are going up. So I work with many businesses that fall into this category. Great founders, deeply, deeply invested in mission, but they can't do much. They have to compete in a market where they have to survive, pay their employees, pay their bills. What would be your advice to such businesses? What should they do now as we speak?
So, of course, if you're running the kind of business you describe, and I know many people who are doing that now, it's hard enough to make payroll. I mean, my mother was an entrepreneur. It's hard, right? Just to keep the business going, sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do, and you don't have the luxury to think about these longer term issues. But you still have the power to connect with other people like you, other business owners, other mission-driven, purpose-driven business owners who can see that what's happening is not good. And the power of a united business front working together to put pressure on a local state, whether that's town, municipality, or the nation state, that's real power. Imagine a world in which business people said, look, like we can't do with climate change. It's too chaotic right now. If one of us tries to invest too much, we'll lose money. What we want is regulation, please. You have to tell us all that we have to not dump our toxic chemicals in the water. And to really demand regulation, the most obvious case of this is the pharmaceutical industry. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact date. I think the 70s. The pharmaceutical industry was faced with a massive crisis because a drug called thalidomide was causing birth defects in pregnant women. And the media was full of these pictures of children being born with flippers instead of arms and grossly distorted bodies. And the industry was like, whoa, not good for business. And really helped to co-create with the government a system of regulation of new pharmaceutical products such that the government certified that, to the best of my knowledge and belief, this is a safe product. That made the industry able to really expand and thrive, and of course gave firms legal liability when there were problems. So you could imagine a world, for example, in which all the airline companies got together and said, we need regulation that says we must switch to climate sustainable biofuels. And we'll do it over this timetable. But you have to force us to do it because that's the only way the whole industry will move. Or in cement, where it's clear we have to change the way we make cement. It's more than 10% of global greenhouse emissions. Get all the cement companies together. Insist that we change. Perhaps you can do it yourself. You can get all the cement companies together and say, okay, together we will all make change. The firms in the textile industry are trying to do this. They have a major vulnerability in abuses in their supply chain. They're trying to get everyone together, look each other in the face and say, okay, we will fix this, because they can see it damages the whole industry. So cooperation is key. And I've talked about cooperation at the local level, about asking for regulation on a particular industry, but you could also imagine political cooperation. Let me pick something at random. We really need a media outlet that everyone believes what it says. Not having a shared sense of what's true is just destroying our society. And so we insist that you find a way that we know at least what's happening. You could imagine that. You could imagine, asking for crackdown on corruption. You could imagine for asking for better education. I mean, these are real examples when firms came together to work with local authorities or local governments or national governments to say, we need you to do this for the good of the whole society, and we have your back. My friends Chuck Sable and David Vitor wrote a wonderful book called Fixing the Climate, which was all about what they called experimentalist government. And what experimentalist government was business and government working together to design regulations that were for the good of the community and worked well for the industry. Of course, there are problems with any process. That process could become corrupt. But if you have a government that wants the best and you have business leaders who want the best, you can really move the industry to an entirely new place, moving together.
Beautiful. I ask a standard set of 3 questions to all my guests, but even before I get into that, I wanted to ask you, how much spirituality played a role in the career choices or the area of work you do? Because when I read your book, I don't know whether you stated this explicitly, but I see that the roots of you goes beyond mere academic pursuit.
Sendel, I'm going to give you a very short answer. I think focusing, let me use the word on the inner dimension, because spirituality, it kind of sounds like it's about spirits or something. And I think there's something much bigger going on here, which is about who we think of ourselves as humans, what our goals are, what we're trying to build with our lives. That is absolutely critical to how we think about the problems we face right now. And you could think of the inner dimension as being in individuals, but also in how firms work, in how societies work. If we're telling each other a story all the time, that humans are only selfish and competitive and interested in the accumulation of more stuff, that story is going to shape a society that's very different from a story that is, yes, humans are selfish and cooperative and competitive, but they can also be immensely caring, deeply worrying about the future of their children and the places in which they live, and as concerned to be in a community that they care about and to feel their life has meaning and purpose as they are to make yet more money. That story and changing that story so that it's a much more balanced view of what it means to be human and what we're about seems to me absolutely fundamental. And all my current work now is about how would you do that? What would that mean at the individual level? What would it mean for organizations? What would it look like at the state level? And so I have a whole new project called the Reweaving Project, which is all about this set of issues. And so I'll just say, next book, invite me and I'll be all about that.
Lovely. Look forward to it. Thank you. And going back to the 3 questions, how do you manage differences of opinion in your work or in your scholarship? Someone disagrees with you. How do you usually approach that?
I love differences of opinion. I think they are the lifeblood of what it means to be really any human being. But if someone says to me, Rebecca, I really disagree, I'm like, great. Tell me why. No, I really do. I love that. Genuine disagreement coming from a deep, heart-centered place. I am totally there. Super, super interesting.
What are 1 or 2 skills which are essential for business leaders today?
Oh my goodness. I have a friend who talks about kindness and math. So I think business leaders need kindness to those around them and most of all to themselves. So many business leaders are pushing themselves so hard. And always, you can always do more and always work harder and trying to do the best thing. So kindness to the people around you and to yourself. And then math. So I'm sorry, but you need to be fabulous at what you do. Highly strategic, deeply operationally coherent, running your business really well. And in fact, I think if you're going to run a mission-driven or a purpose-driven company, it's harder. You need more math because you have to really think about what you're doing. But yeah, kindness and math.
And 1 book you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, the book we've been talking about, Eric Ries's Incorruptible. Excellent.
Lovely.
Really,
Okay.
really worth reading. Because he doesn't just say you should be mission-driven. He's really, really precise as to what that means, how you structure the organization, how you measure, how you run it. And then he talks a lot about the governance structures. So you can be mission-driven, but you want to build a firm that will outlast you and your control, and how to do that. So that's my current favorite book. I think it's really excellent.
Lovely. Rebecca, what an honor talking to you today and reading your work. And thank you.
Oh, Sendel, thank you for taking the time to read the book, for taking the time to reach out to me and talk. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Rebecca's work reminds us that business doesn't operate in isolation. It's shaped by the strength of our institutions, the clarity of our truth, and the health of our climate. If you're a founder or leader facing the tension between mission and survival, or if you're simply wondering what role businesses should play in society, I hope this conversation gave you some new angles to think about. And as always, thank you for listening to Business and Society. Look forward to seeing you again.